Today's Live on Web program on The Truth About ELDs is sponsored by Freightliner and PeopleNet.
The new video intelligence system with forward-facing camera captures it all, not just the visual, but the whole story, so you can see exactly what your drivers see. It's about protection and prevention. We're watching out for the driver, not watching the driver.
Hi, I'm Seth Clevenger, Technology Editor at Transport Topics, and welcome to our Live on Web program. Today we're going to talk about electronic logging and the upcoming ELD mandate. Late last year, the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration published its final rule on electronic logging devices, or ELDs. Under that rule, nearly all carriers whose drivers are required to keep paper logs to record their hours of service will need to install ELDs in their trucks by December of 2017. Of course, some fleets have already been using electronic driver logs for years, and their experiences can help provide some guidance to the many carriers who will be adopting the technology in the coming months. With that in mind, I'm pleased to welcome two guests, Herman Funk Jr., Vice President and General Counsel at Cowan Systems, a truckload carrier based in Baltimore, Maryland. And on the LTL side of the industry, we have Sam Faucette, Vice President of Safety and Compliance with Old Dominion Freight Line, based in Thomasville, North Carolina. Later in the program, we'll also hear from Kevin Tomlinson, past General Chairman of the Technology and Maintenance Council and Director of Maintenance at South Shore Transportation in Sandusky, Ohio. And we also want to hear from you. Email questions or comments about ELDs to share@ttnews.com, or you can comment directly in the box at the top of this webpage. So welcome, gentlemen. Now, before we dive into this, I do have to mention that it's very fitting to have Cowan Systems and Old Dominion on the show because you guys both run green trucks the day before St. Patrick's Day. So we appreciate that, even though we didn't plan it that way. But both of your fleets are already using electronic logs. And I'm sure our viewers are eager to hear how those rollouts went and your experiences with the devices. So Sam, maybe I can start with you, and could you really briefly take us through the rollout of e-logs at Old Dominion? You know, why did you guys make that transition? When did you make it, and how has it gone for you?
Certainly. We started looking at a full telematics platform back in 2008, looking at providers, evaluating what was available at the time. To the best of our knowledge, there was no other national LTL provider that used an ELD or an e-logs platform. So what was out there was usually used in the truckload sector. We really started with providers to see what we wanted, a laundry list, and we piloted different providers to see how they can meet that demand for us, to go much further than just an e-log into a full telematics platform. That evolved into some installs in 2010, and we've been a fully 100% ELD or e-log carrier now for about 4 years.
Got it. And I'll pose the same question to you, Herman. When and why did Cowan Systems adopt e-logs, and how's the reception been so far?
We made the decision to adopt e-logs in early 2011. We again went through the process of vetting providers and decided on a platform that we wanted to use. By the end of 2011, we'd chosen a platform and we began training our operations and safety personnel. And in the beginning of 2012, we started training drivers and rolling it out. It took about 12 months, a little over 12 months, to completely roll it out to a fleet of 1,500 trucks.
Got it. Well, I'm sure many of our viewers would be eager to hear about how well your drivers took to e-logs. That's one of the top questions that comes out there. So Sam, I'll ask you, what was the reaction among your drivers when you first rolled out the technology, and have you seen that change over time?
Well, we've had very good acceptance from the drivers. our driver age, her demographic is a little less than the industry standard. We figured our average age was 47. I think the industry's 57. But we took on our pilots some young drivers and some senior drivers. And really the senior drivers weren't very challenged with it after some education, basic training, and they had a real deep sense of accomplishment once they could master how to use an ELD, and it made them proud that they could learn how to do this.
Got it. And same question to you, Herman. How was the driver response?
I think this might be a good time to point out that the driver corps is not a homogeneous group. We have, even at Cowan Systems, where we have a pretty similar demographic. You have a wide range of experience and competence with electronics and a wide range of backgrounds. So we had some drivers who folded their arms and sat back and said they would never go along with this. And we had some that were eager to learn it. All in all, the acceptance went very smoothly because we do have a very good driver corps. Their average age is in the mid-50s, so they didn't grow up with smartphones and
right.
Electronic devices. And a lot of them have real fat fingers, so they had to learn to deal with that. But they were very accepting of it. They took it seriously. The rollout went very smoothly.
Okay. And I know that you guys conducted an internal survey of your drivers on ELDs. Can you quickly run through the results of that?
I did. In fact, not too long ago, not too many months ago, I did a survey of several hundred drivers and just asked them whether they liked electronic logs or they would want to go back to paper logs. And 80% of our drivers said they liked electronic logs. 75% of our drivers said it saved them time during their day. It made them more productive. About a third of the drivers said that it saved them about a half an hour a day. Mm-hmm. And 40-some% of the drivers said it saved them more than an hour a day. Yes. So there's only a small group, after a couple of years, there's only a small group that would prefer to go back to, that says they would prefer to go back to paper logs. I'm not sure they really would, but they're stubborn. They're not going to tell you that they like it.
Save them time on actually keeping the logs current.
On the paperwork, keeping the logs current. Okay. And drivers, I come from a legal background, and I've always had struggles with the lawyers I manage to do their timesheets on time so that you can bill clients. It's the same with drivers. They don't like to do their timesheets, and you'll find drivers doing their timesheets for the week at the end of the week, and there's no way they're going to get it right.
Now, we did receive a viewer question on driver training from Greg Siphon, president of Siphon Logistics. And he asked if you have a recommendation on a transition plan to prepare drivers to go from paper to electronic logs. And I'll direct that to Sam. Is there any plan or recommendation you give to the fleets out there on how to prepare drivers for making this transition?
Sure, Seth. You've got to train your driver on the transition. We found it very useful after trying a couple of approaches. We modernized our training material, present it to the driver and train them, and then go through a certification process to have them demonstrate the ability to successfully use the e-log system and wean them off of paper. At the end of that certification process, then we're an e-log certified driver. And with full acceptance, they no longer were required to do paper logs.
Got it. What about you, Gene?
Important to remember that it's not just a driver training issue. If you have safety trainers or driver trainers, get them trained up first so that they are very familiar with the machinery, how it works, how it operates, what the problems are, so that they know what they're talking about before they start talking to drivers. Same thing with your dispatch people. It's very important that they understand it, because when the driver calls in, he's going to call his dispatcher first and tell him he has a problem. And if the dispatcher can't help him, then he feels shanghaied or alone. And another important point in that certification process is make sure that the drivers get some hands-on training before you just put them in the truck. Get some units from your manufacturer, set them up in your training room, let the drivers touch them, play with them, learn how to use them, because you can't just install it in the truck and tell them, well, you've got an e-log today, go do it.
Right. And we'll continue to explore how Old Dominion and Cowan are using e-logs in their operations a bit later in the program. But before we go any further, I'd like to provide a basic overview of the ELD mandate itself. Here's a copy of the rule. I'm holding out a printout of the final rule, which is available to view on the Federal Register. The PDF version is 516 pages, so if you're looking for some good reading material over the weekend, there you go. Needless to say, there's a lot of detail in there, but let's quickly review the essentials you will need to know. For the most part, all drivers who are currently required to keep records of duty status will need to move from paper logs to ELDs to comply with the mandate. The rule does list some exemptions, though. First, drivers who use paper logs no more than 8 days during a 30-day period won't need to use an ELD. This could come into play if you have short-haul drivers who only occasionally exceed the 100 or 150 air-mile radius or a 12-hour day. Another exemption covers drive-away, tow-away operations where the vehicle driven is part of the shipment. And there's also an exemption for drivers of trucks manufactured before model year 2000. While the main compliance date for the ELD mandate is December 18th of 2017, we should also note that carriers using devices that meet current specs, known as automatic onboard recording devices, or AOBRDs, will be able to continue using them an additional 2 years beyond the compliance date. In other words, all carriers using e-logs today will have until December 16th of 2019 to upgrade those devices to meet the technical specifications in the ELD rule. So there will be changes even for fleets that are already using e-logs. In most cases, it does appear that technology vendors will be able to make their current systems into compliant ELDs through software updates with no changes to the hardware. However, older systems that can't produce a graphical display of drivers' duty status changes will probably require a hardware change by 2019. For those of you who are already using e-logs through an onboard fleet management system, your vendors are probably working on this now and will roll out changes to make them into compliant ELDs. There will be many different types of ELDs on the market, ranging from full-blown fleet management platforms that provide many features and applications, to more basic low-cost products that focus mainly or only on achieving compliance with the mandate. Under the rule, an ELD is not required to provide communication capabilities between the driver and motor carrier, but it does require an integral connection with the truck's engine to automatically record when the vehicle moves. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a mobile communications platform. The ELD rule also introduces special driving categories for personal conveyance and yard moves. Authorized personal use of the vehicle can be tracked as off-duty, not driving time, and yard moves are considered on-duty, not driving time. The driver will have to indicate the beginning and end of a yard move or personal use. During roadside inspections, ELDs will need to use one of two data transfer options: a telematics transfer method that uses web services or email to send the data file, or a local transfer method using Bluetooth or USB. Compliant ELDs will also need to provide one of two backup options for data transfer. They must be able to produce a graphical display of the driver's log data that the officer can view without entering the vehicle, or the ELD will need to generate a printout of the log data. To be clear, the printer is an option, but not necessarily a requirement. We'll continue to discuss other details of the ELD rule as we go, but for now, let's move on to some questions from our viewers. Looking at some of the questions we received, we did receive a few about how the ELD mandate might affect freight capacity and the driver shortage. So let's go ahead and address some of those. Charles Larry Sr., a group manager at Ryder System, asked, what is the expected impact on the industry in terms of capacity? How many drivers or tractors will be lost due to a choice not to comply? So I'll address that to our panelists. Do you expect freight capacity to tighten due to the ELD rule, either through more accurate enforcement of hours of service, or perhaps even through some drivers choosing to leave the industry? If you want to take that off, Sam?
Sure. The only way I see that as a possibility is if drivers are resistant and do leave the industry. Maybe small owner-operators. Otherwise, it makes for a more fluid system of dispatching and driver and time management when you use an ELD or a telematics platform.
Okay. Thoughts on that, Herman?
I agree with Sam. It will improve everyone's operations, particularly if they opt for a telematics platform that does transmit data back to the office in real time. There are going to be particular parts of the industry that are affected greatly and some that aren't affected so greatly. In putting the ELDs or the onboard recorders in our trucks, our truckload division, we didn't find a loss of productivity or a loss of efficiency. I think when we implement the ELDs in our intermodal division, where the congestion is very bad, where the ports are backed up and there are lines to get in and out, it is going to create a real problem for drivers, and it's going to change the way the business model is constructed.
Okay. Also got a question from Dave Schaller at the North American Council for Freight Efficiency, asking if the mandate could force more tractors to be stationary more hours of the day, potentially worsening the parking shortage, or make the driver shortage a larger problem. Do you see either of those factors being affected by the ELD mandate, Sam?
We actually saw a vehicle utilization benefit after our telematics program was installed. There is an operational aspect to that program, and it was a benefit to us.
Okay. And Herman?
If you are slip seating trucks and you know where your trucks are at all times, it's much easier to schedule the next shift to come in on trucks. There's a lot of operational efficiencies. I don't see, I mean, who knows whether drivers will actually leave the industry. We had a few drivers tell us that that's what they were going to do, but I'm not aware of any driver in our 1,500 or 1,600 driver corps that actually left or quit because he didn't like electronic logs.
Wow.
I think it's the fear talking. The people don't like change, and I think their kind of escape is to say, I'm just not going to do it. But when it comes down to it, if they're trained and you treat them well, I think they're going to adopt it just like everybody has so far.
Okay. I did get a few questions about some of the other details of the rule that I'd like to address right away. We do have a couple questions about ELDs and business size. Deneen Berg of Mike Berg Trucking asks, is there a specific amount of trucks you have to have before you are mandated to use ELDs? And Shelley Logsden of Logsden Brothers asked whether or not it's true that smaller companies and older trucks won't have to use ELDs. So I'll first address the older trucks portion of that. It is true that you won't be required to use an ELD on trucks older than model year 2000, but the mandate does apply across the board regardless of company size. So if you have drivers filling out paper logs today, you'll need to move them over to ELDs unless they fall under one of the exemptions that we listed earlier. It doesn't matter if you're a carrier with one truck or thousands of trucks, the ELD mandate still applies. Another quick one I want to hit is questions about whether or not the ELD could shut a truck's engine down. I got a couple questions from Andrea Velasquez, dispatcher at Garden City Co-op, and a question from Sarah Rapley. And the answer here is no. I think it's actually a bit of a misconception, but thank you for asking so we can clear it up. ELDs are not going to shut down engines. There's nothing in the rule that would require that. So that's one thing you won't have to worry about. And I also have a few questions here about personal conveyance and yard moves. Jerry Sullivan, a safety director, asks when you can and when you cannot use personal conveyance status. And Tracy Thomas, CEO at Bolt Transport, asks us to explain yard moves under ELDs. And I'd love to do that if I could. So let me preface this by saying that a lot of people would like some more clarity on yard moves in particular. But FMCSA did not provide clear definitions on when you can and cannot use yard moves or personal conveyance. And the agency said it declined to do so in this rule because it's really a question about hours of service in general rather than being something specific to ELDs. But I do think it would help if the industry had some additional clarity, and perhaps FMCSA will provide that in the future. So I'd like to ask my panelists how they can count personal conveyance and yard moves in their fleets. Maybe Sam, I'll start with you. Do you have particular guidelines for yard moves in particular? When you use that and when you don't under ELDs and today?
Certainly, it really is dependent on who's making the yard move. If it's a driver, then it's on duty, not driving time. It's part of their workday and part of their responsibility to record that record of duty status. Where we have a lot of questions with the new rule is that if there are technicians or just for instance, one person whose responsibility is to fuel all the trucks at a certain time every day when they're out running or at night, he moves 20 trucks to a fuel island, fuels them and parks them back. With him signing into an ELD or producing a record of duty status, that employee's not under 395. He's not a driver. May not even hold a CDL. He just works for you providing a service. It may be a vendor. Do we want people signing in, producing a record of duty status that's not a driver?
It's an interesting question. Herman, thoughts on that?
So the alternative is that someone monitors the unassigned driving that occurs at the terminal, someone from the office, and they assign it. They find out the truck's in the shop or the truck was being fueled between 8 and 9 o'clock, and they assign it to the person that's doing that work. It's going to be up to everybody in their own operation is what the best way to do it is. If you have your own shop and you have technicians, you can give them logins, and they can log in and test drive trucks or fuel trucks or whatever. We're a little bit different. We turn over our equipment every 3 years, so pretty much all of our service is done by dealers. So we don't know who's going to be test driving trucks. We don't know who's going to be operating them. So what we do is we monitor unassigned driving and we assign it. We check to see who was in the truck and we assign it. It takes a little bit of time, but you're going to find that a lot of things about ELDs takes a little bit of time.
Sure. And that's something that we'll all have to keep in mind, especially first-time adopters. All the people who move a truck, you'll have to account for that on your ELDs and think about how you want to handle it.
And again, the importance of it is that when your driver logs into that unit next, it's going to prompt him and say, there's unassigned driving on this truck. Do you want this to be assigned to you?
Right.
So if you don't take action, it will get assigned to him.
Sure.
And that'll cause problems.
Sure. I would like to give everybody a reminder that we welcome your questions and feedback on today's show. You can email us at share@ttnews.com or comment directly on this article page to send us a question, and we'll do our best to address as many as we can. Next up, we have a video question from Paul Young of Atlas Van Lines, who spoke with us at Technology and Maintenance Council's annual meeting. Let's go ahead and take a look.
I'm Paul Young with Atlas Van Lines, and my question is on the ELD rules is that the driver he still make the edit if he makes a mistake before he changes duty status. Example is that he forgets to put himself into the sleeper, and he goes to sleep, wakes up, and realizes he's still on duty. Can he make that change before he goes actually back to driving? Thank you.
Thank you for the question, Paul. Paul asked about the ability to edit logs. And just to start off, the rule does allow some limited editing of driver logs, but the original recording will still be saved. And also, any back office edits to a driver's log must be approved by the driver, so keep that in mind. And but hopefully the editing capabilities will address some situations where a driver forgets to change his duty status, for example. And as we mentioned before, also keep in mind that fleets will have to account for driving time by people other than their drivers, including technicians or other staff who move the vehicles around. So it might be best for carriers to create separate ELD logins for other personnel who move a truck. Otherwise, the driver will have to reconcile that driving time when he or she is back in the vehicle. And unassigned driving time could be a red flag for enforcement. So I think we addressed that a little bit earlier, but any additional thoughts from our panel on how to handle the logins for folks other than your over-the-road drivers or who will be moving the truck?
That's something that'll have to be looked at in depth, and it's going to vary through experience of where the truck is and exactly what's being done. We don't see it being really yard moves being done a lot when the driver is not responsible and in the truck and actually performing work. There are other ways, though, I think for Federal Motor Carrier and compliance to find those issues. The lat law recording of the truck's movement, odometer checks, there's easier ways to discover, I think, the avenue of unassigned truck movement than someone signing in that it's not, or really shouldn't be under a record duty status requirement.
Got it.
And be aware that putting an electronic logging device in your truck is not the be-all and end-all. It's not going to save you from compliance problems. The worst thing that could happen is you put them in your trucks and you think everything is fine. That thing is generating a report every day of unassigned driving. Every time a truck moves, it's generating a report of all the violations. So you've got to be on top of those. You've got to look at the unassigned driving every day, look at the violations, try to sort it out so that your logs are accurate.
Got it. And one of the most common questions that comes up about the ELD mandate are concerns about leasing and rental trucks. We got several of those from our viewers. John Donnarumma, Safety and Compliance Director at American Gas Products, asked how long-distance rentals will be handled. Now, and we've got a few others as well. How will a rental truck be dealt with when going over the road for more than 8 days? I will say that FMCSA has made the point that it doesn't regulate truck leasing and rental operations, but that does not change the carrier's requirement to use e-logs. You still need an ELD in there. In the end, I think it's the message is that it's ultimately up to the industry to find out how this is going to work. Carriers potentially could install portable plug-and-play ELD devices in their lease and rental trucks. It could be that lease and rental packages on their own to help their carrier customers comply. So we'll have to see how that actually plays out. And I'd like to ask our panelists, Sam, what are your thoughts on the best way for the industry to handle this issue with ELDs and leased and rented trucks?
Probably to install the device when they make a long-term lease on a truck, and hope they don't have to make many 1 to 2 day leases just to replace broke down or in maintenance equipment. Some of these devices from different providers are pretty simple to install. They can do it in just a few minutes. Others with an onboard computer, an OBC that hooked directly to the ECM, can take a little longer, but still within a couple hours a truck can be equipped. If it's a requirement, it'll have to be met.
Got it.
The latest generation of devices are pretty much self-contained units that plug into the diagnostic port on the truck. So I foresee in the future, when we rent a truck, whether it's short-term or long-term, our driver taking the device that we use, a spare, a unit that's for rental, and plugging it into the diagnostic device. Now, you're going to have to authorize that truck number ahead of time in the computer system. He logs in and gives it the truck number, and he's off and running just like he's in one of your regular fleet. There is going to be some issues with cabling. Different trucks have different diagnostic plugs, so you're going to have a variety, 2 or 3 different kinds of plugs to fit all the different manufacturers. Hopefully there'll be some standardization.
Got it. Yeah, it's something we'll definitely be following in the months ahead. I'm sure this is on the top of mind for a lot of folks, and we'll see how the industry addresses it. I got a related question from Ricky Abel, Senior Manager of Safety and Compliance at Medline Industries. If a portable ELD is used, for example, in a rental truck, does it have to be connected to the rental tractor or truck ECM port, or can just the GPS function only be used? It's my understanding that it still needs to connect with the ECM to provide that integral synchronization, I believe is the way the rule puts it. It still needs to be connecting with the truck to accurately.
It does. It has to take the truck's mileage,
Yep.
and when the engine on and engine off, and when the truck is moving, it has to be directly plugged into the truck.
Got it. And another quick reminder that continue to send us your questions and feedback during the show as we go. You can email us at tnews.com or comment directly on this article page. Next, let's go ahead and get back to how e-logs have affected operations and business processes at Old Dominion and Cowan. So I'd like to ask the panelists, do you find it easier to manage hours of service compliance and make better dispatching decisions with electronic logs? And do you have a better understanding of the driver's situation as a result? Sam?
Yes, it's much more precise. we're a very structured operation anyway in the LTL market. It's most like us operate on a hub and spoke system. We know the distances between our points of drivers to service centers, drop points, but we can also, with some operational aspects to our telematics program, go in and look, see where a driver's at. Are they making progress? Are they too far out? Before they have a problem, we can sort of predict the distance being covered, especially when weather applications come. It gives us a lot more predictability, some transparency with the driver and with the vehicle. It's been a great operations, and as far as safety compliance, going from paper to e-logs, we used to use an imaging process for paper logs. That is now our backup contingency plan, and that's one thing that I would advise everyone needs to think about is a contingency plan. If your provider goes down, an hour is not a big issue. If your provider goes down for 8 to 12 to 20 hours, you have to have a backup plan to handle all that paper logs and data coming back at you, even not just from the driver's standpoint, but in the back office to rebuild all those logs. So develop you a good contingency plan and put it in practice occasionally to make sure that it works. But it's been a great savings for us on time and effort, and we get a lot more precision with our operations.
Got it. And Herman, I'll ask
And
you the same thing.
you have to remember to remind your drivers to keep a paper logbook in the truck, because they're still required to have one. That's one of the 2 violations that you'll frequently get with electronic logs is the driver doesn't have the instruction card for law enforcement in the truck, and he doesn't have a paper logbook because they forget about paper logbooks and they don't have them in the truck. Somebody said knowledge is power a long time ago, and it's true. When you have a telematics device on your truck and you know where it is and where it's been and how fast it's going and when it's likely to reach its destination and where your drivers are going, it allows you to manage your business much, much better. It allows you to find problems that you wouldn't normally find. I had instances where I found out about problems that had been going on for years that drivers had been covering for and fleet managers had been covering for, customers that were uncooperative that caused problems in the operation. Once the e-logs are there, you find out that the driver is moving the truck when he shouldn't have to, or that the customer is forcing him off the lot. The concern that drivers have about harassment is a valid one, but there's a flip side to that too. No longer can a dispatcher tell a driver, do the best you can and get the freight there. We know exactly how many hours he has. We know exactly how long it's going to take to do the run and how much time he has to do it in. So it backs the driver up when he says, I don't think that this can be done.
Got it. And as we all know, form and manner violations for driver logs are among the most common roadside violations, and they are often simple mistakes made when the driver fills out his or her logbook. So I'd like to ask both of the panelists here, if you've seen a decline in your fleet and the frequency of those types of in these and other types of hours of service violations as a result, and has it had an effect on your CSA scores?
Yes, we haven't seen it have a negative effect on our CSA scores. In fact, it's been a little change. Our scores were good when we were on paper because we're pretty much regimented and know the distances and how these drivers will drive. It makes sure any violations you have more discoverable. They're easier to find. There's less back office time for folks manually auditing logs and checking into runs that may be questionable as something the driver submitted that's not quite right. It makes for a more efficient operation pretty much overall.
Okay. And Herman?
When you go on an electronic logging device, your hours of service violations, particularly the real hour service violations, will go away. It will solve the problem with very few exceptions. Like I said, having an instruction card or having a backup paper logbook or the device malfunctioning and when a truck is stopped on a roadside, but it will drastically improve your hours of service compliance on roadsides. And the earlier you adopt it, the better, because the big fleets are using them. If you're not using them, you're going to look bad by comparison.
Got it. We got a question from Lori Joe. Do you see driver pay changing? Less pay per mile percentage and more hourly pay as an enticement to increase driver retention? Thoughts on that question?
not in our business model. 50% of our drivers roughly are pickup and delivery drivers that are home every night. They run the city during the day, so they're already hourly paid.
Okay.
When electronic logs are instituted in your fleet, if your drivers are spending a lot of time waiting at docks or ports or at shipper locations, and they're not being appropriately compensated for that detention time, then I think you will see a big change in driver compensation, because they're not going to be able to hide that anymore. If they have a tendency to hide it now, they won't be able to hide it anymore. The clock will be ticking. So if your drivers are sitting for 2 hours and they can't get around the hours of service problem, they're going to expect to be compensated for that.
Sure.
There's no question.
I do briefly want to address the driver harassment issue. Back in 2011, a previous FMCSA rule on electronic logging was thrown out by a federal appeals court for not adequately addressing concerns about driver harassment. In response, FMCSA has issued a rule back in November that prohibits carriers, shippers, and brokers from coercing truck drivers to violate hours of service or other safety regulations. So I'd like to ask each of our panelists, do you believe the recent driver coercion rule, as well as the language in the new ELD rule, sufficiently addresses concerns about driver harassment? Sam?
Certainly. Well, I don't think we were exposed to that to the extent truckload carriers were because of our function. I think it is very well addressed with the rule.
Okay.
I think the rule is about as good as you could expect, and I think it's a good one. Of course, it's difficult to legislate respect. So if you respect your drivers and you love your drivers, then you're not going to be coercing them, right, and you're not going to be harassing them. But and the rule is going to create some complaints by disgruntled drivers against carriers that didn't really do anything wrong, and it's going to create some problems for carriers complaining about drivers. But in the main, I think that it's going to be fleshed out, and it's a good rule.
Got it. I also have a very good question on the effect on shippers. I've got the following question from Troy Stevenson, who's a procurement manager at OI, a glass manufacturer. So from a shipper's perspective, what specific items do we need to address to survive in a 100% ELD environment, so from the shipper angle? Sam?
I guess for the most part, delivery times or pickup delivery time accuracy, if you're an appointment customer or contractual customer who works off appointments, it works both ways. It's always great for the carrier to be able to get service when we have an appointment, and likewise be on time for our customers.
Got it.
Exactly right. It's going to require shippers to be more efficient in scheduling deliveries and pickups. A driver who is on the clock and feels that pressure, that time pressure every minute of every day, is not going to be happy sitting in line or waiting 3 or 4 hours to get loaded or unloaded. And you're going to find that carriers are going to shy away from shippers that don't have efficient operations. One of the first things that we dealt with when we implemented electronic logs was we found where those problems were, and we worked on helping the shippers do a better job of scheduling things. So we promised them to show up on time, and they promised to either give us the ability to drop and hook or to get us delivered, loaded or unloaded on time, keep the driver moving.
Got it. So better communication, coordination between carriers and shippers, and
right,
and sticking to appointments, right?
Yep.
I mean, just it sounds like that relationship is going to be more important than ever. I also had a question for the panelists. Do you think some shippers will actually ask carriers to begin using ELDs sooner rather than waiting until the compliance deadline? Do you see that happening in any cases?
There may be some that do. There are some shippers who, take safety regulations to heart, and as general counsel, I look at all the contracts and I'll see these long, involved contracts where shippers want to spell out every safety regulation and ask you to represent that you're complying with it, when it's really your business and not theirs so much. But there will be some that ask for that reason. There will be some, but I think there's a general tendency among shippers starting back in 2014 and early 2015, whenever capacity gets tight, shippers try to lock up capacity.
Yeah.
And I think this may create some fear that there's not going to be enough capacity, and they may be looking for carriers who have adopted the ELDs and built them into their operation so they know there won't be disruptions.
Okay. And do you have any additional thoughts on that, Sam?
I think a carrier can be very proactive with a shipper and just come right out and let them know they're ahead of the mandate. They're currently using ELDs or a telematics program to let them know they're at the top of their game. It builds a confidence in the relationship between the two.
Got it. I also have a question from Randy Gunter, owner at RTG Logistics, who's asking how the new ELD rule will affect freight brokers. Is this sort of a similar thing to shippers where carriers and brokers will have to work more closely? I mean, what are your thoughts on how the rule will affect the brokerages out there?
Boy. Brokers, that's a whole separate subject,
yeah, right?
It will do the same thing to the brokerage world that it does internally. The brokers are going to be faced with cold, hard facts and scientific evidence about how much time there is and whether or not a delivery can be made.
Right.
And there are going to be maybe brokers that ignore that, and there are going to be brokers that acknowledge that and deal with it. The brokerage world, they deal largely with smaller carriers
right.
and a lot of carriers, so it's very difficult for a broker to police things like that amongst their carriers. They pretty much have to take the carrier's word for it.
Sure.
It's been my experience.
Okay. And maybe one thing I'll add is going back to the driver coercion rule. Is going to be important for that nobody in transportation is seen to coerce a driver to violate hours of service regulations, and that'll be more important than ever.
And it will be very important that carriers, small carriers, not turn over the control of their truck and their driver to a broker. You don't want brokers instructing your driver. You don't want brokers asking them whether they can or cannot make it, or pinging them in the middle of the night and asking them why they're not there yet. That kind of thing. It's bad for a number of reasons, but one of them, the driver coercion rule.
Got it. And maybe just a kind of a bottom line question on safety. Do you guys believe that ELDs will improve safety across the industry? Sam, you can take that one first.
Oh, absolutely. It's improved our safety program at Old Dominion. It's what we hadn't really talked about yet is with a good basic telematics program, you can go in there and look at how your driver's performing as well as how's your truck performing. Are there red flags coming up such as sudden starts, sudden stops, curve events, what we call OERs or onboard event recordings that can give you an opportunity to intervene with a driver if you see there's some issues for coaching or retraining or whatever the case calls for. It gives you a very good insight to driver behavior and performance that we've never had before.
Okay.
Yeah, those are all collateral benefits to having the telematics platform.
Right.
The electronic logging in and of itself, it's not a safety tool. It's a compliance tool. If you have a compliant operation, it's not going to really change much, other than it's not on paper anymore. Now it's electronic, and it takes a lot more administrative work. But it doesn't. An ELD is not going to make sure that a driver gets rest when he goes home on his 10-hour break. It'll make sure that it's easier for FMCSA and for your safety officer to find out when a driver is driving too much, but it won't change his fatigue factor that's caused by non-work conditions, for example. But it will certainly help with compliance.
Okay. And there's an opportunity to address safety as well with some of the fleet management platforms that have other types of applications that fleets can use to better manage and track their operations and take a look at driver behavior, as we discussed. Shifting gears a little bit, I recently spoke with Kevin Tomlinson, Director of Maintenance at South Shore Transportation and past chairman of TMC. He shared his thoughts on ELDs a couple weeks ago at TMC's annual meeting in Nashville, Tennessee. So let's go ahead and roll that video. Hello, I'm Seth Clevenger, Technology Editor at Transport Topics. I'm here in the exhibit hall at TMC's annual meeting in Nashville, Tennessee. and I'm joined here with Kevin Tomlinson. He is the outgoing chairman of TMC, and he is also director of maintenance at South Shore Transportation, and you guys are in Sandusky, Ohio.
Absolutely.
And he's here to talk to us about ELDs. So what are your thoughts on the topic? And you know,
well, Seth, a great question. I mean, there's a lot of stuff been going around. We finally have, it's been passed or set down that ELDs will be have to be in place by the end of next year, so
right.
2017. And so there's all those questions of, we haven't been on them at
right.
this point. We are installing now. We just purchased some for our tractors, and but there's some questions that come along with it. You know, we're
sure.
not a real heavy, big fleet, but you know, how much is it going to change? You know, you could always, I guess, for a lack of massage paper logbooks, and now that's not going to be. Not that we would want to do that, but it won't be as easy, I guess, for lack
right.
of better terms. Not you can't do it. So because of that, does that change? Is there a percentage of units that we're going to have to be purchased to continue to haul the same amount of freight that we have
right.
today? So is that number? We have 160 trucks. If it's a 10% change, is that 16? I'm going to go buy 16 more trucks.
Yeah.
Go find 16 more drivers and put 16 more pieces of equipment on the road when we have people that are a little bit excited
okay.
about the amount of traffic we have out there already. So
okay.
so that's a big question that
yeah.
I have in my mind. I mean, you know, we do a great job as a carrier, and but you know, there's limits to what we can accomplish, and this is going to change some of those. So
okay. So there's a bit of a question about driver productivity and based on the precision, I suppose, of how drivers' hours are
right.
recorded.
Absolutely. I mean, you know, it's guys, snowstorms and the breakdown and all of that stuff accounts for time, and once the clock starts ticking, it doesn't stop.
Right.
And so that'll be challenging. I think it'll be challenging for a little while. I think this is something that people have brought up. I don't think this is any new news, but it's definitely a concern and something to think about. I mean, we're trying to accomplish not as many vehicles on the road, and trying to do that with trailer sizes and hauling more freight and possibly changing weights and what have you to stop more equipment, but yet now we're sort of limiting ourselves to the fact that we're going to have to put more equipment on the road to continue to deliver the amount of freight that we have to haul now.
Okay.
So definitely a challenge.
Okay. And how's the rollout going so far for you guys? I mean, where are you on that stage?
We have just started putting them in.
Okay.
Maybe got 6-8 trucks put together. We just started them last week, actually, and it's not a real hard install. A couple hours, you know, depending on the truck make and model, but not a big thing. We're getting used to that.
Sure.
It'll be fun. That process
right.
will be fun, and you know how truck drivers are always a little excited about that. So
yeah.
hopefully we can calm that process down and get them familiar with it
right.
before we have to go live with it.
Okay.
So,
any steps you guys are taking to keep the drivers on top of it?
Well, we're trying to put it in some of our local equipment, our more local equipment,
okay.
and get those guys used to it, because they can come in and ask a lot of questions, and we're going to try to get them trained up on it. So then when our road drivers have some questions, we can sort of divert them to those
right.
guys to ask, and you know, they work well with each other, so it would
okay.
be okay. So I think once they understand the process and how how it works, I don't think it'll be a problem, but you know, it's going to change how we do business to a point.
Right.
I mean, and everybody else. So
yeah. What do you think it will mean for the industry as a whole when you think about the number of companies that are making this transition right now? I mean, it's certainly the majority of the industry that has yet to move, I think, to e-logs.
What it will do is it will definitely level the playing field, I guess, for a lack of better terms. You get 60 hours to work a week or 70 hours to work a week, and that's what you get.
Got it. Any other thoughts on the topic?
That's my thoughts.
Okay, great. Well, thank you for joining us, Kevin. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for your input.
All right, thank you.
All right, thanks a lot. Welcome back. That was Kevin Tomlinson, Director of Maintenance at South Shore Transportation and past chairman of TMC, sharing his thoughts on ELDs a couple weeks ago at TMC's annual meeting. And I think Kevin raised some good questions about driver productivity, so I'd like to pose the same question to our panelists. Do you think the industry will see, the industry as a whole will see a reduction in driver productivity due to the ELD mandate? Sam?
I don't think they will. Realistically, if the driver and the carrier is operating within the guidelines now, there should be little or no difference.
Okay.
The first thing that comes to mind was Kevin was introduced as a director of maintenance, and we haven't
Correct.
talked about maintenance. Don't forget your maintenance department. If you have 116 trucks or whatever he said he had, the ELD device is occasionally going to break. Mm-hmm. It's going to malfunction. A driver is going to drop it or throw it out the window or use a ballpoint pen on the touch screen. And you have to be ready for a truck to be down because the thing doesn't work. And you have to have the backup plan, either use the paper logs or have a service center someplace nearby that you can get some help. Mm-hmm. That said, I don't believe that this is going to cause a big difference in productivity. I think that's really the fear talking. We're all afraid of the change. It's going to change the way we do business in some places. Mm-hmm. It's going to make us better. We're going to be able to manage our trucks better. And in some places, it's going to point out places where we're doing something that we can't legally do or that we can't efficiently do, and we're going to have to adapt to that.
Sure. And speaking of ELD malfunctions or problems, I got a question from Dennis Poteet, lead instructor at Vincennes University. He's asking how ELD breakdowns would work. And the rule does have some language on that. In the event of an ELD malfunction, drivers will be required to notify the carrier within 24 hours, and the carrier will be required to take action to fix the ELD within 8 days. In the meantime, drivers will have to use paper logs to record their hours, and they'll have to reconstruct their logs from the previous 7 days unless they're able to retrieve it from the ELD.
Correct.
So keep that in mind. But about this issue with malfunctions or problems with the devices, I'd like to ask each of the panelists if you've experienced much of that at all. How common is a device failure or maybe a tampering issue, or has that been pretty rare?
In our experience, early on in the program, there was, with any kind of technology, you're going to have issues that you overcome, whether it's vehicle grounding, and it's going to differ if you have an OBC or just an ELD, how it hooks up, whether it goes to the ECM or directly to the diagnostic port, it's going to be a big difference. They're pretty robust. We haven't had a lot of downtime caused by the equipment, but there again, we have a very effective method of recording malfunctions, equipment needing repair, and have available equipment because we're a slip seat company, so we can put that driver into another truck. And I will say that a driver, if he has a choice, we have seen this time and time again, between a truck that is ELD equipped or telematics equipped versus one that's not, they will almost all the time take the one that is, because it is so much less work for them to maintain that paper record.
Got it. Yeah, and I have a question here from Oswaldo, who's asking, do you find it was easier to get driver buy-in before implementing e-logs and letting them provide insight into which system you eventually purchased? And do you keep an inventory of spare ELD parts for any short-term or rental trucks you may have in your fleet? So I guess not parts, but spare devices for rentals or lease.
We do. We keep the unit that we use now has a computer in the truck and a display unit that's cabled to it. The display unit gets most of the abuse and has the most problems. So we have extras of those that can be plugged in. And as with any piece of equipment, it's important that you inquire about service networks and how you're going to get the things repaired, because you're probably not going to repair them yourselves. You're probably going to be relying on the vendor to do that, and they're electronic devices, so they have to be installed correctly to work.
Okay. And you guys keep some spares on hand?
Oh yes, we have about 39 maintenance locations now. These are fully equipped shops with a safety stock. Some of the lesser parts or the more common parts, such as cables, will be kept at service centers. We do probably most, I'd say 95% of ours in-house.
Okay. We also have a question about IFTA here from Casey. What are the pros and cons of using the ELD data to create your IFTA tax returns?
Oh, the pros and cons are the same. It's accurate.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, hey, all right.
I mean, it automates the process. You don't have any questions about reconstructing things or knowing what your IFTA return should look like. It's all recorded automatically, and it's a matter of running the data.
Okay. So even though ELD is for hours of service and IFTA is for for tax purposes, it's okay.
It's really a telematics question more than an ELD question, because as you know, the ELD doesn't have to report in real time.
Right.
And it does have to record hours of service data and mileage and things, but if you have a regular telematics program, you're going to get position, location, and state line crossings on all your vehicles in real time all the time.
Okay,
so.
Got it. Any additional thoughts on that, Sam?
Sure, our telematics provider has a very robust program we use for taxes. With 7,600 trucks, it is a great asset to us.
Oh, it's a necessity. I mean, you couldn't live without it. Yeah.
Got it. I have a question from Brian. Are the new ELDs required to or going to have geofencing? I didn't see any sort of requirement in the rule about that. That may be something that some technology vendors offer. So I would view that as an option rather than something to expect. And on that same line of discussion, here's some questions about the different types of ELDs out there. Russell Jones asks us, are there any software-only options? Let me just answer that by saying that there has to be some sort of hardware involved. In some cases that could be your existing technology platform if you already have an AOBRD. It could be proprietary hardware from a technology vendor. It could be a mobile device. But if you're using a mobile device, you still have to connect with the truck. So you'll need some sort of way to connect with the ECM. So there is some additional hardware there. In fact, we may actually see technology vendors taking advantage of factory-installed OEM hardware moving forward. The truck manufacturers have rolled out remote diagnostics platforms that have their own, in a lot of cases, have their own hardware installed on the truck already. So it's possible that some technology vendors will latch onto that. But in the end, there's not a software-only option. You do need some sort of hardware to connect with the engine somehow. And I did have another question on that, on the same lines from Burl Tate, asking if handheld devices with ELD programs or ELD apps will be legally acceptable. Again, you need to have some sort of connection. It does need to connect with the engine.
And there has to be a hard mount.
Yes, that's true. It has to be mounted.
Can't be.
If you're using a smartphone or tablet as your display, you do have to have a way to mount that in the vehicle. So it can't just be a mobile app only. It does need to connect with, use a black box or a cable to connect with the engine. But I think you'll see that one of the most common types of ELDs out there will be devices that incorporate smartphones or tablets. And I think we've already answered a question from Kevin Moore. How are we getting the data from the truck? This is the language in the rule is an integral synchronization with the engine ECM. It has to automatically capture things like engine power status, vehicle motion, miles driven, and engine hours. So it's a connection with the ECM. A question that I'll relay to the panelists here is one from Jim Dobson of Airgas. What is your plan to meet the requirement that an officer has to be able to view the E-log from outside the cab with current fixed-mounted devices? How do you guys plan to handle?
Long cables. I guess that's the answer. The rule says that the driver has to be able either to print out the log or show the display outside the cab. So he's going to have to be able to take the display unit and hold it out the window. I'm not sure that all of ours so far are installed in a way that that's possible. We'll have to.
Okay, so that's an open question.
Yep.
What about you, Sam?
Currently ours is a fixed device. It's not removable. But there are tablet devices that are completely portable, sit in a charging cradle. There's a lot of options within the time period we can adapt to. It will
Okay,
be
and I think the language is that it has to be viewed, so I'm not sure if the officer can view it from, inside the cab, while still being outside the vehicle as is required. And maybe a follow-up question on that. Do you guys plan to continue using fixed mount, or do you see yourselves moving toward more of a portable product? And do you have a preference between those two?
We've kind of decided, I think, that we're going to continue with a dedicated device or a fixed mount device. I have a lot of concerns around the reliability and the robustness, if you will, of a smartphone or a tablet device. There are some very good ones, and there are some that aren't really made for this. And I have concerns about drivers leaving them at home or having a malfunction or them breaking. I think we're going to stick with a dedicated device.
And Sam?
For the moment, we'll stick with the hard mount device, but I do see in the future it will come to a tablet per driver. The driver will not only keep his records of duty status on a tablet, there'll be a lot of other information, and that tablet will accompany the driver everywhere.
Okay.
And he will mount the tablet when he drives the truck, and it will acclimate him to that unit.
Or the tablet will be able to talk to the telematics device that's in the truck using Wi-Fi or Bluetooth.
Yes.
There's some of those systems are already out there. You can use the tablet to scan shipping papers, to capture signatures, to capture data from customers, and it talks to the device in the truck.
Got it. We got some questions also on device certification. We got a question from John Gaither about this, on how FMCSA will police the vendors who say they are compliant but might not. So just to back up a little bit, FMCSA does have a certification process, but it's a vendor self-certification process. So I think there's definitely a grain of salt to be taken with that. Ultimately, the device manufacturer just has to test and assert that it meets the technical specifications of an ELD. But FMCSA isn't necessarily vetting those devices. There is a process by which the FMCSA can remove a device from the list if it's found to be non-compliant. But there's definitely a buyer beware element to this. Just because a device is on a list, keep in mind that it can also be removed from that list. So there's some due diligence on the carrier's part to make sure that your vendor is going to be compliant and is on top of the regulation. And you'll have to make sure that you do the necessary legwork and ask the right questions of your vendor to make sure that that's the case. Thoughts on our panelists on the current certification process? Any advice you give to the carriers out there?
I think buyer beware is good advice, because there's a real trap here for people who are captivated by the lowest cost or something like that. I think it's important that your vendor know the business, know what the trucking business is like. I think it's important that the customer learn the rules so that they, as you said, so that they know the questions to ask. I've met with vendors, even very recently, who told me their devices are completely compliant, and they are not, either because they don't know or because they are scrambling to catch up. So it would behoove everyone to use somebody who's been around for a while and knows the business.
Okay. Thoughts on that?
I would also, that's correct. I would trust but verify. Get those credentials, keep them on file, because you may need them.
Got it. So FMCSA is maintaining a website of self-certified ELDs. I checked earlier this week, and there's still only 3 on there, but expect that to increase rapidly over time. And that could be a good starting point, but maybe once you get some names from there, do your due diligence and look into the vendors from there. I have a question from Steve Elliott, Vice President at Rail Transport. How many carriers do you estimate use ELDs today? I personally don't have any hard numbers on that, but I do think it's safe to say that it's still well under half the trucks on the road today are on e-logs. If I had to give a very rough guess, I'd say maybe between a quarter and a third. I'd say adoption is definitely heavier among larger fleets. some mid-size and smaller fleets are also using it, but probably not quite as frequently. Panelists, what are your thoughts on the current deployment or market penetration for e-logs?
I think that's an accurate guess. In the LTL market, we know about where the competition is or is not with their programs. In truckload, it's just an observance going up and down the road to seeing how many trucks do you see marked that are e-log compliant. I will say, though, that enforcement is getting very much with the game now on roadside, where a couple years ago you may not have seen such in-depth checks for an e-log. Now they're learning. We have helped them learn as best we can as to what to look for and what is available, more or less on roadside to look at a driver's record of duty status, so they'll get a good understanding of what they're looking at with our drivers, and it benefits and goes downhill to other drivers also.
Okay.
Yes, in 2012, enforcement pretty much passed the truck by if it had electronic logs,
Yeah.
and that's not true anymore. They're checking them, the same way they would have paper logs.
Okay. Good question from Michael McKinney, president of AM Transport. For a small carrier that has not been using electronic logs of any type yet, what would you suggest as the first couple steps to finding the best product? You guys are larger than this company in all likelihood, but
the vendors are very eager to educate us and to provide these products. So meet with there are lists, and I think there are lists published in Transport Topics and some of the other magazines of all the providers that provide e-logs today. Meet with them, make appointments, meet with the top vendors, the major ones, compare how their system works and how well it will fit with your operation. The information's available if you want it.
sure.
Exactly. I would advise them to get the basics, know what you want when you go shopping, and look at what's available, but also look to the future. What do you think you're going to want? Are you going to be able to handle this data, and do you think you have a need for it? If you don't, you'll end up buying twice.
And another thing, another piece of recommendation that I'd like to provide is, I'd certainly encourage you, if you haven't adopted yet, start looking now. I mean, don't wait until the last minute on this. You really will not want to try to rush this at the end. Now's the time to be looking around and planning for this. December of 2017 will be here pretty quickly. So I do think it would behoove you to start planning now. I'd also like to ask a quick question of our panelists on if you have any concerns about the interoperability of different ELD systems. This is something that could play out potentially if a fleet brings on owner-operators on board, maybe even through mergers and acquisitions. But are you concerned at all about different ELD systems, managing different ELD systems within an operation?
We're very concerned about it, and we've made the decision that maybe two, but certainly no more than that. We may have two different systems because they have to operate on different web portals. We have the technology to integrate the data into one place, which is important. We have a large owner-operator fleet, and we're going to have a higher turnover in that fleet, and they're going to start coming to us with other solutions. And we've pretty much made the decision that we're going to require them to buy, either from us or from somebody else, one of two chosen technologies, and that for at least the time being, we're probably going to be absorbing that cost so that we don't scare them away right off at the get-go.
Okay. Any concerns at all about interoperability? Sam?
Yes, we will have a single provider. We use a single provider now and always have. While we do have a drayage division with probably less than 100 ELD strictly units, telematics platform is most beneficial to the company because of the operational, the maintenance, and the technology capabilities that are there. But we will, yes, I wouldn't want to think about multiple providers. Okay.
And I've gotten several questions here about the cost of ELDs. I won't go through them all, but they all kind of hit on sort of the basic question of how much this will cost. I think you'll find a wide variety of prices out there. Ultimately, it just depends what you want to do. I mean, if you want to just have a basic compliance that that'll cost you one thing. If you want to do a lot more, and there's opportunity to do that once you install hardware in your truck, you can do a lot more with telematics as we've discussed here. And of course, I think in the end of the day, you kind of get what you pay for. So if you're looking for something that's low cost, I think you'll be able to find that. And if you want something that's more feature heavy and has all the bells and whistles, you'll be able to find that too. FMCSA estimated that an average cost per vehicle per year would be $495. So that's their estimate on what's average, and they have costs ranging from $165 a year to $832. But I really think that all just depends on what you're doing, what kind of features and applications you're running. So it's definitely not one size fits all. Maybe as we look to wrap up here, I'll ask our panelists a final question about the language in the ELD rule itself. Are there any sticking points that you guys see? Is there anything that kind of raised a red flag with you when you look at the final rule? Any concerns about the language, or are you pretty content with what you see?
I don't think, not too much jumped out at me, other than there's some places where they sort of bleed over into the hours of service rules without really amending them. And the driver harassment rule is going to need to be fleshed out because we don't really understand what the process is going to be there. But I think, other than that, I think it's pretty clear.
Okay,
Sure.
Sam?
And we entered comments back during the rulemaking, and I think they were more or less addressed. We didn't get everything we wanted between the carriers and the providers, but it seems to be a good compromise and a pretty good rule. I think it's doable for the most part, from our perspective anyway.
Great. Well, gentlemen, this has been an excellent conversation, but we'll have to leave it there for now. You've been watching Live on Web. Tune in again on April 20th as we discuss Transport Topics' top 50 logistics companies. Let me again extend our gratitude to Herman Funk, Vice President and General Counsel at Cowan Systems, and Sam Faucette, Vice President of Safety and Compliance at Old Dominion Freight Line, for joining us today. I'd also like to thank Kevin Tomlinson, Director of Maintenance at South Shore Transportation and past Chairman of TMC, for participating in our interview. And I also want to express our appreciation to our sponsors, Freightliner and PeopleNet, who made today's program possible. If you missed part of the show or would just like to watch it again, a replay will be posted later today on our website, ttnews.com, and on liveonweb.ttnews.com. Thank you also to our production team at Live on Web, Kevin Eaton, Brandon Green, Wanda Johnson, Gary Kaczynski, Tara McClelland, and Shihab Mustafa. We'd like to hear your reaction to today's broadcast. Head over to our LinkedIn page and comment on this episode at ttn.ws/LOW-is-linked. And don't forget, Live on Web also is available via podcast. Go to iTunes, search Live on Web, and subscribe. Until next time, I'm Seth Clevenger, Technology Editor at Transport Topics. Thank you for watching.